Leanne, thank you very much indeed. And very warm welcome to this, the latest in the series of New Age Business Briefings, brought to you by the SABC, and today sponsored by 49M. And earlier on, you heard from the Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Malusi Gigaba, who spoke to us about many issues, and we're going to unpack them a little bit further on. And he mentioned Eskom and Transnet at great length during that conversation, because when it comes to infrastructure spend, they pretty much, along with a few of the other state-owned enterprises, are going to have the lion's share of that expenditure. Well, let's meet the CEOs who join us now, starting with my far right, the CEO of Transnet, Mr. Brian Malifa. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the program. Always a pleasure to chat to you.
Thank you.
And the outgoing CEO, Brian Damas at Eskom, who set the cat amongst the pigeons a short while ago, announcing his departure. But we've still got you for a couple of more months, so we'll chat a little bit about the future and some of the spends that the Minister was talking about. Brian Damas, thank you very much for joining us. Minister, tragic news about this crash at Lanseria. Details still sketchy. Your thoughts? I'm sure you sat up once you heard that there was a plane crash. And it's not just the financial figures at SAA that are crashing.
Actually, the financial figures at SAA are showing improvement. I think the turnaround is beginning to sink in. We've saved over over R1 billion in operating cost. As we announced last year, we had said when we spoke last year that we expect that over the next 3 to 5 years, the airline will continue making losses, but we will turn the corner and begin to improve as the turnaround strategy gets embedded and is implemented. But I must convey my sincerest sympathies with the passengers on that aircraft, even though we do not know any details at the present moment, but if there were any fatalities, we convey our sympathies to their families and hope that God will comfort them.
All right. There's a lot to talk about SOEs, and we've got the CEOs here, but let's just finish SAA very quickly. We're talking a lot of CapEx. When are you going to get some decent planes for SAA?
We are in the process of doing that. You will remember that over the last 18 months, we've taken delivery of 5 A330s. And now we will be taking delivery of the 20 A320s that are part of the 2002 procurement that we made. So we are gradually taking delivery of the new aircraft and are already deploying them on domestic and international routes. And many people have already commented on the comfort, the sheer pleasure of being on the new SAA aircraft. But with regard to the new fleet procurement, which arises out of the turnaround strategy, it was important that we should pay attention to the local policies such as localization, the industrial policy plans, to ensure that we don't just throw our money to the OEMs and say to them, just sell us the aircraft and not ask the question, but how are we going to benefit from this procurement? Because ultimately, whatever investment we make on any aircraft and any other service in the economy, we need as a country and as a people to benefit. And we are working on programs to ensure that there are synergies between South African Airways, South African Express, and Denel Aviation, which are going to result in the development of a vibrant aeronautical industry in the country. And so it's important that any procurement that we undertake bears that in mind.
All right, we'll chat a little bit more about that. Brian Damas, Eskom, Madupe, is it going to be ready?
Yeah, that's what we have indicated. And we sat with our teams this week, and they're still on track for the second half of this year. You know, Eskom, from an infrastructure perspective, the infrastructure is happening. I think we have, for a long time, moved from talking about it to action. We have learned lots of lessons. I'm very comfortable that the company, from an institutional capacity, has implemented that in systems, processes, and organizational structure. You know, no company in the last 3.5 years has spent more capital in creating productive assets in the company, has trained more people. Last year we trained 12,000 people, has created more local industries, has supported black-owned companies. We've increased the spend on black-owned companies by 300% over the last 3 years. And if you go to those infrastructure projects, you'll see them happening. We've created jobs. We've just completed the return to service stations. All 3 of them is completed, now fully production. And today, from where I stood in the bush in Lephalale, today you have one of the largest infrastructure programs in the Southern Hemisphere. And that is happening throughout the whole of South Africa. And Eskom has been doing this over the last few years.
Are you confident, though, that we won't have these kinds of delays throughout the CapEx expenditure that's planned for the future?
These projects are extremely complex. These are some of the largest infrastructure projects. You know, this has happened to us before, when Eskom built this in the 80s and 70s. And actually, if you go through the history, you'll find that Madupi and Kusile is happening at 3 times the pace than Eskom's previous built programs. You know, Eskom's large power station, at the end of its construction program, was Majuba. Majuba started in the early 80s, and the first unit was finished in 1996. And so Eskom has gone through this. Big global power companies has gone through this. Big international mining companies has gone through this. The question is, how do you learn from that? How do you deal with long-term planning? And government has addressed that now. How do you deal with capacity? We've addressed that through project management capability. The Presidential Infrastructure Commission has got a very hands-on approach to deal with things such as labor, your access to land, the permits, the environmental issues. So I think these are big, complex projects. I'm comfortable that the structures and processes are there. We have a long way to go. But I think it is a partnership between business, us as state-owned companies, labor, and then the local communities to make sure we achieve these.
Brian Malifa, here's a question from Anonymous on table number 22. So it's probably down to 10 people on that page, on that table there. The taxi strike today disrupted transportation. We're wondering when we will have proper alternative transportation, such as reliable train system. Any plans? And today it's raining and it's coming down in buckets. They're probably feeling it more than ever. They want an alternative. How quickly are you going to be able to provide that alternative for them?
You'll remember that the mandate of Transnet is just the transportation of goods and not passengers. But notwithstanding that, we think that the Passenger Rail Association of Agency of South Africa, PRASA, is doing a sterling job. They have a plan. They have just acquired new fleet, as we've read in the press, and they are planning to have a huge capital expenditure in the improvement of passenger rail, transportation of passengers. And we actually admire, as Transnet, what they are doing at PRASA in terms of trying to improve the rail commuter network.
Who builds the tracks? Is it PRASA or you?
The tracks. The tracks in the urban areas are owned by PRASA, and usually, typically the long distance or the long haul are in our balance sheet are in the Transnet asset register. So we share them. Sometimes our trains go onto their tracks, sometimes they go onto our tracks. So it depends on which one it is and where it is. But typically in areas like Gauteng, between Soweto and Johannesburg and Pretoria, that would be PRASA. But between Durban and Richards Bay, between Richards Bay and MLO and Mpumalanga and Durban and Johannesburg, it would be Transnet.
All right, okay. A lot of questions that we have. Let's go straight to the tables now. Table number 18, Lifadi Makibinyane, where are you? Table 18. And if you could tell us who the question is for.
Okay, my name is Lefadi Makibinyane, Chief Executive Officer of Consulting Engineers South Africa. My question is to both CEOs of Transnet and Eskom. And I said, my question was, what are your companies doing to mitigate the flawed triple PFA procurement service or act as far as procurement of professional consulting engineers in particular? So I just want to find out, what are you doing? Because we'll understand that consulting engineers are the backdrop of any infrastructure. Planning and design, front-end loading of design of infrastructure requires the skills and the craft of consulting engineers. And that's a very critical industry in this country that is really requiring attention by government, and not only by Consulting Engineers South Africa as an association of consulting engineers. We represent about 510 firms.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, let me take the question, because they are implementing the policies that we make in government. We are in discussions with the National Treasury and the DTI to find an amicable solution to the challenges posed by triple PFA. And so I'm hoping that we've had a number of workshops where we've looked at a series of alternatives. And I'm hoping that in the next few weeks or a couple of months, we should make an announcement as to what changes are going to be made. You will remember that in the past, the state-owned, until December 2012, the state-owned companies were exempted from triple PFA. It allowed them to implement a wide range of transformative programs in their procurement so that we could support the objective of developing black business and black industrialists. And we are in discussion so that even with the exemption having been removed, but we have a leeway in the state-owned companies, because precisely to implement the policies that the President spoke about, setting aside certain jobs and businesses for young people, ensuring that, because when the President spoke on the 11th of January, he was very emphatic that transformation and empowerment are going to be key in implementing these radical and faster economic transformation programs over the next 5 years. And the question is, how does the triple PFA assist us? I think it doesn't assist us very much to achieve that objective. And therefore, what we are discussing is what can we do to ensure that whilst we don't depart from the main thrust of the problems it was established to address, but at the same time, it doesn't serve as a hindrance to economic transformation and empowerment, so that we can address the concerns of black business. Because black business, from Black Business Council, BMF and others, have all been raising this concern about the triple PFA. And from where we sit, we share their concerns and we're trying to address them.
All right, let's talk about black business. The two Brians, you talk about supply development, but once it gets beyond a certain amount, you start to see the same faces winning tenders and getting the gigs over and over again. How are we going to develop new players? You often hear stories of someone, one week he's building roads, next week he's supplying something else, next week he's got another tender for something else. How do we manage this? Comments from both of you.
I think I can share a little bit of our experiences. We were very adamant that as we start the construction of power stations, that quite a bit of that should stay in South Africa. And up to now, we have physically contracted 63% of that to South African companies. So I think that policy framework, crucially important, and that amounts to some 80 billion rand that has gone to South African companies. The next issue is, how do you then create capacity? And how do you make sure it does not go to the established players? So we've been quite clear as to local to our sites. So in our Madupi example, you can go to the community where people have created capability, have been partnered up with established companies, and now have significant amount of contracts, and are now supplying not only, in our case, some of the the rakes on our coal reclaimers, but are supplying that into mining, the general mining sector, which now really start building that. So I think it has to focus on this concept of creating black industrialists. So that means people, black companies, that create something new and be able to then participate in the economy through that and then stay in business for that. We've done it in coal. Today, the Exaro that you have has been created out of the work Eskom did. And it's very important that black players then stay in those companies, run them, and operational enable them. And we have enterprise development programs that help people. So you can go to people today and you can listen to their stories where some of this is happening. But you're very right. There's a lot of work for us to do to make sure we spread this wealth in the country.
And Brian, how does the smaller supplier become a big supplier? Can he do it with Transnet?
Indeed. I mean, there is a focus on the very big projects that we do, and there is a perception that the same people get the jobs, but that is not the case. What stands out certainly at Transnet is our announcement last year, which the minister made, to give the fuel tender of in excess of 15 billion rand to groups, companies that belong to, that are black female-owned companies. And so that certainly stands out as an indication of where we stand on this matter and what we are willing to do. The contract did not go to the usual suspects, which are the big majors, but it went to black-owned, female-owned fuel companies, which we hope will be able to establish these companies that are black female-owned in the fuel industry, which is a very difficult industry. The other award that stands out at Transnet, of course, is our auditing, both internal and external audit contracts, which have been given to black-owned firms and did not go to the usual suspects or the big five, as they are called. And I think that also demonstrates what we are doing, certainly at that level, but hopefully also in the entire supply department, in the procurement of Transnet goods and services. That is how we will approach business.
Okay. Lebahang Shole, table number 19. Lebahang, table number 19.
Thank you. My name is Lebahang Shole from Muteng Investment Holdings. We are a property and investment company. My question essentially is to Mr. Brian Molefe with regards to the Triple P projects in Durban. What is the progress thus far, the status, the Durban Port, Digard Port project, and what also else is on Transnet's pipeline? And also to Mr. Brian Damas, the CEO of Eskom, beyond Medupi, what else is there on your list? Thank you.
Okay. Let's start with you, Mr. Molefe.
We have purchased the land at the Durban Digard Port. We are in the process of finalizing the purchase of additional land, which we will need for the project around the airport, and we are in negotiations for that. At the same time, we are conducting FEL1 studies, which include environmental assessment and determining if there was any contamination of the land by the activity of the airport in the past. We are also identifying the species of insects and animals that are there for purposes of the environmental impact assessment study. I can tell you that so far they have found 9 black mambas on that site, and you're fortunate that you never found one in your luggage in the past when you went through that airport. But we are doing it's still the early stages of the environmental assessments, and then from there we have a sort of an artist's impression of what that port will look like when it is finished. From there, after the environmental approvals, we will go into detailed engineering and also finalize the funding model after we have done the initial environmental assessments. The other projects that are happening in Durban, as you would know, is the dredging at Pier 2, which is the deepening of the berths at Pier 2. You will have noticed that we have already put in the new tandem lift cranes at Pier 2. We would like to extend the berths at Pier 2 as well, but unfortunately, as you read in the papers, our environmental application was returned, not completely rejected, but it will just cause a delay because they have asked us to address certain issues in the application that were not addressed. We hope to expand to Salisbury Island. We are in negotiations to expand our staking area to Salisbury Island at Pier 1. And those are the big projects at Durban. And of course, just outside, there is quite a lot of property transactions that are taking place in the port, the Portland and back of port operations.
All right, thank you very much.
Just briefly from an Eskom perspective, to understand what's going to happen is just to know what we have. I mean, we have a big power system in South Africa and a big transmission network. They, on average, 30 years old. All of that will have to be replaced. So this construction after Medupi and Kusile will last for the next 20 years, if not longer, throughout the country. So that will include how do we expand the system beyond Kusile? Is it more coal stations? Is it nuclear stations, gas or hydro within the region? And then a massive transmission and distribution networks that must be built in cities and towns. So Eskom's program is going to last certainly for the next 20 years.
Brian, while we're with you, Kungwini writes and says, I don't agree with Brian. Eskom has not yet transformed their procurement, still white-driven. Have you got stats to prove the transformation for him? Because he's got his own thoughts. What are the facts say?
He has his own thoughts, and we have a long way to go. Let's not say we have arrived. We have a lot that we should do in how we deal with that. So what are the stats? Last year, we spent over 70 billion rand on broad-based economic empowerment companies. We spent 21 billion rand on black-owned companies. A big part of that is black women-owned companies and 1.2 billion rand on black youth-owned companies.
What's that as a percentage of the total? So in other words, how much of your spend is...
So 78% of our spend has gone to broad-based black economic empowerment companies.
Okay, all right. I think that answers his question. We'll take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll continue taking your questions at home as well as the audience here. And we're talking public enterprises. Stay with us.